Hello. So I'm Philip from Sosta. I'm not going to introduce myself. My bio is on the schedule, and we have only 20 minutes, so I'm going to jump right in. I love mod page speed, but I wish it could fix my problem with third-party scripts. All right. I am a third-party script author, and here's a question. Do you use JavaScript? Who here uses JavaScript? All right. Who uses third-party JavaScript? All right. Do you load it like this? No. Why not? Well, it works well with browser look-ahead, right? The browser can look at the HTML and decide which scripts to load up, so that's a good thing. But it blocks everything else. So it blocks page rendering, and you could use async and defer, but there's still issues with that. So I was sitting in Barbara's talk the other day, and she calls these third-party monsters because they're so bad for your performance and security, right? And then I was in Andy's tutorial, and he's like, well, go on then, get rid of all that JavaScript, right? Let's defer it, let's load it asynchronously, let's not put it in there. We have that waterfall, we want to get it loading as fast as possible. So there was this second way of loading JavaScript that came up, document.createElement script.src is equal to whatever, and it loads up asynchronously with the rest of the document. Great, right? We don't block anything, except it loads in parallel. It still blocks the onload event, right? So this thing will load up, but the onload event will not fire up until anything that was started downloading before onload finishes downloading. And there's another problem now. In the previous case, we knew exactly when our script finished downloading, so we knew when we could access the API that the script provided. In this case, we have no idea when it's loaded up. So we have no idea when we can start calling the API, right? Or we get JavaScript errors. So we came up with something called a method queue pattern. Who here uses Google Analytics? Great. Do you define that array called _GAQ at the start? Right? That's basically the method queue pattern. Right? It's an array or a queue that you push methods onto, and whenever the script is ready, it'll start processing them. So I'm first going to talk about the method queue pattern because that's important to actually having asynchronous and non-blocking scripts. So there's JavaScript up here. I'm assuming since you use JavaScript, you also know JavaScript. Essentially what we do, so this is what would be in your page. Define this array, and then add the script node that you need to run, so some site.com or your third-party site script, and then start pushing methods onto that array so that whenever the script loads up, it can read through that array and figure out what you want it to execute. You could pass in a list of parameters. What you do with that array is completely dependent on how that script works. So in this case, I'm just passing parameters, but you could also pass a callback function to get data back from it. Inside the script, so the previous part was inside the web page. This is inside the JavaScript. What it needs to do is look through that array. So as soon as it starts up, look for the array, pop out everything from that array and execute those methods, and then rewrite the array. So rewrite the push method of the array. So now we're creating it's an object that we have a push method that actually executes anything that was pushed onto it. So if the push method is called, right, if this push method right down at the bottom is called after the script has loaded, it then directly goes and executes that method. But if it's called before the script is loaded, it stores it in a queue, waiting until the script is loaded. So now we have a way of figuring out, or rather executing dependencies on that script only after the script is loaded, without actually knowing when the script is going to load. It'll load when it loads, but there's also a case where it might never load, right? It still blocks onload, right? It still blocks onload, and it could never load. So has everyone heard about the third-party single point of failure thing that Pat wrote, the third-party black hole? So if you set something like Facebook or something to a black hole, and you try and visit a page that depends on that, it's never going to load up, right? The same thing happens if that server goes away, right? Now, me as a third-party script author, I was concerned about this. I didn't want my customers' sites to block or never load up if my data center was down, right? So I wanted to come up with a solution that would save my customers from this problem. So IFrames to the rescue, right? But IFrames, they still block onload, right? Who here thinks IFrames is a good idea for performance? Not too many, all right. So traditionally, the problem with IFrames is you load an entire web page inside that IFrame, and so all of your main page is going to block, or rather, onload is going to block until everything within that subpage is loaded, right? But not if you don't actually have a subpage. So what happens if you load up an iframe that has no source, or a source set to about blank, or JavaScript false, right? In that case, there's no subpage to load, so onload fires immediately, right? So we took advantage of this fact that you can create an iframe with a source set to JavaScript false. So we create an iframe with source set to JavaScript false, and just for safety, we also set its a style so that it never shows up. We could set visibility false, display none, whatever you like, and then put that onto the page. So this is part one, right? You need to memorize this, because I'm going to refer to it in part 2 and part 3 and all the parts that go ahead. This is simple so far, right? There's nothing major we're doing. We're actually injecting that iframe just before the first script node on the page. What happens if there's no scripts on the page? Well, there's guaranteed to be one script, this script, right? There's guaranteed to be at least one script, which is this JavaScript that we've written. So the iframe might go into the head of the document. We don't care because it's never actually displayed. So the JavaScript :false is the key to solving this problem. Because it doesn't point to any URL, there's nothing to load up, and so onload event for that iframe fires immediately, which means as far as the page is concerned, that resource is marked as loaded. And it doesn't need to wait for that resource to load further, even if we add more stuff to that page, to that iframe later on, right? Now, we tried other things. We tried about blank, right? That seemed like a good idea at the start, except on IE6, if you have a page loaded over SSL, about blank is considered insecure content. So you get a mixed content warning if you have an iframe that's pointing to about blank. So we use JavaScript false. It kind of works as secure content instead of about blank. So that's all the IE6 issue. Except, as a third-party script author, I have no idea what that first party is going to do on their website. And sometimes they set document.domain. Do you know what document.domain does? So very interestingly, if you don't set document.domain, then iframes communicating between each other, they can communicate if they're in the same domain. So if you don't set document.domain, the domain of the page, so you take the host name, take off the first part, that's considered the domain by default. And if all the pages within iframes are on that same domain, then they can communicate across each other. If you do set document.domain, now the domain of that parent page changes to whatever you've set, even if you set it to the domain it was before. And now that child frame can no longer communicate with that parent frame because it's considered a different domain. So we basically had this problem. We had customers who had set document.domain, and they were not going to change their page. And we couldn't collect data because we were just getting this exception thrown. And then they started complaining that, hey, there's this exception about document.domain. Oh, Steve, want to take a picture? So what did we do? We came up with a workaround for that. So you first try to access that iframe. So from the parent frame, try and get a handle of that iframe. So that's where the first part is. Doc is equal to iframe.contentWindow.document. Now, if document.domain is set, that's going to throw an exception because you don't have permission to access anything inside iframe. So we catch that exception, and at that point, we check the value of document.domain. And now we create an iframe whose source is JavaScript, right? So it's JavaScript, which does document.open and sets document.domain. So now we've created an iframe, which as soon as it's created, executes JavaScript that sets document.domain within that iframe, right? And then we can get that, we can get a handle to that document, because now the domains match. except they don't match for very long. Right? It turns out that once you start writing code into that iframe, the domain gets reset. So your code that runs inside the domain has to reset its domain again. Right? So we now create a function. This is still running outside the iframe. We create a function and assign it to the inside of that iframe. We can still do that because the iframe hasn't run yet. And inside that function, we set document.domain again. And then we do a document.write. Who likes doing document.write? Good for performance. In this case, it doesn't matter because we're doing a document.write into an iframe that's already loaded. Right? And we don't care if it blows away everything. So we do a document.write body.onload, execute that function that's going to set document.domain and then load up our third-party script. All right? So if you notice that function up there, it does two things. Create a script that's got the script URL, the third-party script that we want to load up, and set document.domain. So now we have, this is the old familiar pattern of asynchronous dynamic scripts, just loading inside an iframe. All the magic we've done so far is to create an iframe that completes loading before we actually load anything into it. Right? So notice that we set that again. So important thing to note now, as a script author, you now have two documents to deal with. You have the document that's inside that function, so the function that we've defined. Now, because we've defined this function in the parent window, document inside there still refers to the parent window. But since this is going to be run in the context of the child window, this refers to the child window. So you have two different documents, and we need to play around with this and not with document. I spent about 2 weeks trying to figure that out because I kept setting document.domain and it did nothing because I was just setting the domain of the parent document. So we ended up with this finally. And so once we're inside that script, we still have two windows to deal with, right? We want our script to interact with the parent page, so it needs to have a handle to the parent window. So essentially what we do inside our script, we add some more code to the method queue pattern. We first create a global variable. Notice I don't use the var keyword there, so that it's forced to be global to the entire iframe. And I alias that to window. So this is the first line that just assumes that script is going to run within the parent window, either as a static script node or a dynamic script node. Then what we do is check to see whether it's running within the iframe, and if that iframe it's running in is the iframe that we created using our JavaScript up there. So if I go back there, you see I set the ID to JS iframe async. You can use any ID you want, so if you're using different scripts, use different IDs for them. So the script can detect whether it's running within the iframe that it expects to run inside. And we have to do this because there's cases where our script is going to run inside a window that's itself running inside an iframe because that's the way the customer set it up. So we need to be able to know which iframe we're running inside. And if that is true, then get a handle back to the parent window. Now, since we're in the same domain, we can do that. I had some questions. People asked me questions before about doesn't the domain change because this is a new iframe without a source element. So interesting experiment you can try. Right? Go into Chrome or Firefox or any browser. Just create an HTML page with an iframe inside that. And using your DOM inspector, look at location.href and then iframe.location.href. Right? You can set that iframe source to about blank or JavaScript false, but location.href will actually be the location of the parent iframe, which is very strange because the parent document is not actually loaded in that iframe. Right? So we set this alias to the parent window, and then we declare another global _MQ, which is now an alias to the parent's MQ. All right? So now we have a method queue pattern that can work either whether if it's running within the current window or inside an iframe in a parent window. It'll still access the parent's method queue. All right? So we have two window objects now, global, or in the case of Boomerang, we call it boomer.window. refers to the parent window. That's the window we actually want to attach all events to. So we want to attach to the onload event, click events, any events we want to attach to that global object. Whereas window is something we can play with and do anything with because it doesn't affect the parent page. So if you want to load additional JavaScript, you want to load CSS, do experiments, you do it with the window object. And all of that happens in that sandbox of that iframe without affecting the parent frame. Right? So we now have two different window objects, one we can play with and one we actually do our work with. So in summary, I actually have more slides, but this is the main part of it. So in summary, create an iframe with source set to JavaScript false, set document.domain only if needed, and if needed, set it twice. Write a dynamic script node into that new iframe that has no source, and alias the parent window. Right? Result, happy customers. That's Jonathan Klein, happy twice, because he was our customer twice. Is he in the audience? Right. So I've written a blog post about this. It's on the performance calendar for last December. It's also on the log normal blog. And we have a bug open, or the feature request open with the W3C to actually make this much smaller into a single line, just saying defer or async and don't block onload. That would make it much simpler, and the browser could still look ahead, right? So go ahead and vote on that. There was this cache busting feature that is also in the description. I can go through that really quickly because that's all it takes. If you call location.reload with true inside a document, it'll reload that document without sending with sending no cache headers to the server. So it'll not reload from cache, which is a great way if you have a far future expires header for your third-party script and you can't change the URL. Go ahead and do this, and it loads up that script from the server. Right? It works in 99.9% of cases. There are some bad proxies that don't work well. There's a blog post about that too, so I won't go into that. Right after me, there's this guy. And right after him, there's this. Right? So come and join us at the Evolution Cafe for rum drinks. Thank you. Any questions? I think we have 20 seconds for questions.
I have one. How did you actually go about packaging this, and giving it to a client? Would you give them a JavaScript or just an iframe? What do you think is the best way to do it?
So we actually give them this this snippet of JavaScript, the 3 sections 1, 2, and 3 that I showed you. We put that. I'll show you. So all of this JavaScript basically minified. Tell them to stick it into their pages. Right. There's actually a function wrapped around this so that it's easier to call.
I think there's time for one more question.
All right. Nicholas, you want to come up and get set up?
I have one.
All right.
Actually, it's not a question. It's you did the reload thing kind of quickly, and I remember. Can you just mention what you told me about browsers that never cleared their cache and how you had old versions of your script?
Okay. So when we try to reload cache, since we actually have a third-party script that we cannot change the URL of, if we change the URL, it'll break all of our customer sites. So we need to flush cache this way. What happened when we first tried it is some customers reported browsers going into an infinite loop. And I'd be sitting there looking at our HTTP logs, and I just see this thing coming through over and over again. It turns out some browsers have problems. Firefox 3.5.11, for example, doesn't do anything. Right? It reloads things from the cache, but it doesn't actually tell you that it's reloaded. So it just thinks it needs to reload again and again and again. So what we did to get around that was our scripts actually have a version number in the script itself. And when the reload happens, we check to see the version that has been loaded up. And if it loaded up the version we want, we stop reloading at that point. Now, we're also doing interesting things like attaching to a location.hash to sort of mark that we have reloaded. Turns out that affects the history on Internet Explorer 8. So if you hit the back button, you start going back inside that iframe and not back in the parent page, which is what customers actually want to do. So our customers started saying, hey, why is log normal dot thing showing up in our user's history, right? Because that's JavaScript. It shouldn't show up in the history. So we started researching that and found that out. So no location.hash. Don't do anything other than use the script itself to figure out if the script has been reloaded. Right?
Right.
So again, all of that is mentioned in the blog post, which is why I could skip over it.
Thanks a lot, Philip.
Thank you.